Let's bring in now William Lawrence, who's a professor of political science and international affairs at American University. He's also a former senior US diplomat, and he joins us now from Washington, D.C. Welcome back to the program, Professor. Joe Biden really does seem to be ramping up the rhetoric against Vladimir Putin, calling him a dictator and his actions in Ukraine a genocide. It's a term that US officials have been careful to avoid until now. What do you make of this? What is Biden trying to achieve by using that language?
Biden's trying to ramp up the rhetoric, and he's getting advice to ramp up the threats. And it doesn't mean that you have to carry through on threats, but since Putin only seems to understand the language of force, particularly in these types of circumstances, that's okay. It's okay to ramp things up if it has the result of stopping Putin or having him reconsider or enter into negotiations. Famously, the U.S. had the red line in Syria, and Obama famously didn't carry through. He said it was a 51-49 decision, sort of wrenching, but that was seen as paramount to the overall failure of the U.S. policy in Syria because a red line had been drawn. But the U.S. didn't respect it. Therefore, the Russians didn't. And some say that set us up for the current moment if the Russians are starting to deploy chemical weapons again. So we're at a critical moment. I think we can take the White House at its word that if it's not going to go in based on a single or limited deployment of chemical weapons, that's probably true. But I suspect if the scale of the atrocities, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, and the use of illegal weapons reaches a certain point, then we will see growing pressure for and eventual deployment of military force in Ukraine from the outside to create humanitarian corridors, as has been proposed by four former Supreme Allied commanders of NATO who believe that there is a responsibility to protect civilians in Ukraine if it reaches a certain level of atrocities. And that's part of this mix of using this type of language.
Yes, let's talk more about this so-called red line. As you say, in previous conflicts, that red line has been identified as the deployment of chemical weapons in conflicts. So if or when Putin does decide to unleash those weapons in Ukraine, do you believe that the US would have no choice but to intervene in a more forceful way?
Well, they've already said they won't. So what I would expect in the short term after an initial deployment would be a ramping up in sort of every other way. So a ramping up in cyber, a ramping up on the sea, a ramping up in the air and in intelligence sharing, but in ways that avoid direct conflict with Russian troops by NATO troops. However, if it reaches a certain level, if it's repeated attacks, if the atrocities number in the hundreds or thousands of victims to chemical attacks, which starts to look like World War I, which is why we have these bans in the first place, then I think the pressure would be overwhelming for the U.S. and NATO to intervene militarily, either defensively to protect civilians or offensively to end the war. And either scenario is possible. Of course, there's the risk of nuclear war once they go in. It's sort of interesting if I can have another moment here. That the U.S. and the international community often seem to focus on nuclear and chemical weapons almost as a way to focus on something rather than dealing with the big thing. And the big thing in Syria was 500,000 civilians killed by barrel bombs, which should have been illegal and never really reached that threshold. And I think what matters here is less the type of weapons and rather the amount of civilians being killed. And if it reaches a certain threshold, the international community simply can't tolerate it anymore.
Okay, Professor William Lawrence, it was really good to get your analysis as always. Thanks again for joining us.